All right, set a timer. See if I can keep this thing under 45 minutes. I think that people resonate with the just off the cuff talking and not the chops and just getting the sort of raw thought. And I just have to trust my train of thought in that. I don't think I trust it enough. And yeah, I wanted to make a video. I was making a video about how I still borrow from the Christian worldview. As any good apologist would probably say, well, duh, of course you're borrowing from the Christian worldview. But I do it deliberately. I do it intentionally. And I think that's something that apologists probably harp on as a way to sort of win points for the Christian religion, to say that, oh, if you see the world this way, in this moral way or this narrative way, then that's only because you were made in the image of God, that God set these things up this way. You're borrowing from religious worldview for your morality and so forth. I think it's the other way around. I think it works in your favor to say that, we got morality from religion, rather than thinking maybe we got religion from morality. We are not the only animals in this world that have morality, have a moral, like a fairly complex moral system. It gets more complicated as the brain and the society of those individuals with those types of brains gets more complicated. But one thing I think that makes humans quite different from other animals in the animal kingdom is our use and our ability to create narrative. And maybe that comes from, maybe I've read somewhere and I'm piecing it together in my brain right now, but maybe that comes from our ability over other animals to recollect in the past and also predict the future. Our ability to meta think, to think about our thoughts and to imagine ourselves in the future doing something different than we are doing right now. I think a further conclusion of that would be is that you're seeing points that have happened and may possibly happen in the future, and you're trying to see how those things all connect. It just got really dark in here, and the light, I guess this light will work. So with morality and narrative, you do get things like religion, where there is not only a right way to do things in society. There's wrong things to do and right things to do. Those right things to do or wrong things to do are also under the umbrella of a story. And I don't think we'll ever escape that, which is why I don't think we'll ever escape fully religion, even in the wake of the secularization of the world. We're not, especially at least in the West, we're not nearly as religious as we once were in some ways. In an odd way, people get even more fundamental. But I think it's this grasping. I think it's going to be always a tug and pull or push and pull of wanting to have a grand narrative of life that helps you make sense of your story. And ultimately, not just make sense of your story, but this desire that your story has meaning, that it has not just meaning, but eternal meaning. And I think that's more so what I want to talk about today, rather than my use of narrative, because I have been reading the Bible as a use of myth. And I don't say myth in a pejorative way for people who are religious listening to this. I don't mean it in an insulting way. I mean it in what it is, in this grand narrative, supernatural story of our place in history, and that this idea that there is something behind the natural curtain of life, that there's some other world going on behind it. And I think that we'll always have need for that, just based on how we were wired. And so instead of simply trying to reject that, I would like to live in that truth. And when I say truth, I mean, I love the way this one YouTuber put it. I forget his name off the top of my head now, but he said something like, something can be figuratively true and literally false, meaning that to have a certain belief and move through the world in this way with this figurative truth, it is true to think of life in this way, that if you do things this way, they will have beneficial effects. Praying, binding people to religious authority, to divine authority, will connect people in a way that maybe trying to get them to do it outside of that wouldn't work. I believe that there is a reason why religion has lasted this long in human history, because it is useful. It is very, very useful for not just the journey of human society, but also the journey of individuals within that society. So something can be figuratively true and literally false. And I think that's my approach now to Christianity. I think some of the things in Christianity are both figuratively and literally false. I don't think they work in this space. I don't think they ever, well, maybe they worked for the time being. But then there's some things about it that I believe are really true. And depending on how you define those terms, I think the issue was that people would want to be so literal about these things, the existence of God and this us being made in the image of God and his or her, their interaction in human history. I don't think that it had to be as literal. I use language like God, spirit, soul, and I'm okay with those words. I should skip past this part because it's not really my main point. I'm trying to lead up to this idea of meaning. And I think that's what, as I was trying to make that video, I kept thinking about how people would push back or have questions. And I think before addressing our need for narrative, I really think that we have this desire for meaning and eternal life. And I think some Christians will say, because I have that desire makes it true. And that's such a logical leap for me. Just because I desire something doesn't necessarily make it true or necessary or obligated to me. I could desire to be 9 feet tall. I have a deep desire for that. And because I desire it, it must be true in some form, some life. And it's like, no, you can desire a lot of things and it doesn't necessarily make it true. So this desire to feel like what I'm doing matters and that it's worthwhile, that what I'm doing now will somehow echo in eternity later. I think our rejection of the finality of death plays a part in that as well. All we know is the known. And I think that animals who don't have this ability as sharp as we do to imagine ourselves in the future. And we keep imagining ourselves so much in the future. And then we realize that there may be a point in time, as I've seen other people go before me, that I will not be in the future, but I can't imagine myself not being there. That is unsettling to me. So it is quite comforting to think of a scenario where I will always be there. I can imagine myself versus animals. There's no real qualm for them because they don't think that far into the future. They're very much present with whatever desires they have. I think that's a good and a bad thing. I think that's what separates us from the animal kingdom in some sense, where if I'm a dog, like I am fully present with my emotions now. When I'm hungry, I want to be played with. I want to run. I need to pee. I need to what? I am fully present with what my body and mind desires at the moment. And I'm not really concerned about what my life will look like in 2025 or in 2035. Will I be around? Dogs are not contemplating that. Dogs are not suffering from that desire. I'm not saying dogs can't imagine themselves at all in the future. I don't know the psychology of dogs in that way. Maybe I should go read a book about it. But I guarantee you, humans are unique in that sense that we start to imagine ourselves over time. And it gets really difficult to try to imagine in time frames that we've never quite experienced, which is why it's like really trippy for, a 6-year-old to imagine themselves as a 36-year-old, because that's a lot of 6 segments and they don't even remember the first half of that 6, versus I think the rest of us could imagine ourselves in our 40s. Once you've lived to be 20, you're like, okay, if I just double that, that's 40. Or I've known 10 years, and so I can imagine 10 times 2, that gets me to 40. You sort of do these, you try to multiply some way in your mind. But the point is, we just want to exist. And I think that for me, I desired so much for life to continue. And once you sort of don't play that game anymore, where you don't have this deep desire to always exist, then the lack of eternal life, the lack of an afterlife, is not as discomforting when you accept finality of life. Because for the religious person, particularly I'm talking about Christians, that's my space that I came from, death is not final. Death is a sleep, a slumber. It is a pause. It is a break in the totality of life. But I think, again, I bring up the afterlife because it's tied to our desire for meaning, that what I do now will mean something later. And so it motivates me rather than being fully present with the moment that is now. Every moment that we have, with this idea in mind, every moment that we have must always be tied to a later moment. Like, this moment can't simply exist for what it is now, because we're always constantly thinking, how does this moment matter in the future? And I'm not saying that's wrong to do that. You've got to plan finances. You've got to plan your health. You've got to eat healthy today to serve the later version of you well. You got to spend your money and invest your money in a way that serves the later you well. It would be unwise to not see yourself as this community of individuals that are spread out across your lifespan, and you have an obligation to the community to do your part today. So I want to serve tomorrow's version of me well, and I hope that tomorrow's version of me will serve his tomorrow's version of him, and so forth. So it's not wrong to think in that sense, but I think that we're trapped with this need for something to mean, rather than just being like, well, that's just the way it is. Like, I think sometimes people, what I mean by that is, some people, Christians, religious people, when they ask me, how do I find meaning or morality, and how can I live with that? How can I live with that prospect of it ultimately meaning nothing? And they say that as if it's a negative thing. And they say, well, because I'd rather there be a life of meaning. And so therefore, if the opposite of what I believe, the alternative to what I believe, doesn't have this sort of grand narrative, this sort of grand story maker who has me in mind, who has not just the history of humanity in mind, but particularly me in mind, then I don't want it. So I'll go along with this. But that just makes that worldview useful. It doesn't necessitate that it's truthful. Again, going back to the idea of, like, just because you desire something doesn't have to make it true. It makes it helpful for your predicament. It makes it useful. It makes life less uncomfortable for you. But it doesn't necessitate that it has to be this way, that there is no other way that things can be, that maybe there is no grand orchestrated narrative to this life. And so they try to push with that. But again, you have to play along with the game for it to make sense. Once you let go of this thought, like, actually, I really don't need an afterlife. Because again, what would the afterlife give? If the whole purpose of life is to serve God and his glory, and then there's going to be like this afterlife of no pain and no death and all that, then there's just this ongoing, you lose narrative at this point. You lose a plot. What makes life, even with all the suffering that I don't justify, though Christians try to figure out a way to justify with the problem of evil and how God allows so many terrible things to happen, there still has to be a plot for them. But in any case, there is a plot for everyone individually and as society, as locally, nationally, and globally. We have a plot that we're all trying to play a part in. But the plot is gone once this thing is over and we just live a life with no ups and downs, no struggle. And we say that that's a good thing. I just can't imagine it. It makes it really difficult. Maybe it's just my degenerate heart. I don't know. Or maybe I need a regenerated heart to imagine a life that is actually a desired thing. That I can, there's a song, 10,000 years and then forevermore. Bless the Lord, oh my soul. Bless the Lord for 10,000 years. I can't imagine 1,000 years. But eternity is not 10,000 years. Eternity is the absence of time. And I can't even fathom that. To live in a existence where time doesn't exist. But not only does not time exist in this world, neither does a plot. There's not anything that you're working towards anymore. You find yourself back in the same position as I'm in right now. Is that you're just doing things to do things. But it's for the glory of God. But it will be for his glory. And there's not a hopeful thing. You'll see your family, you go see your parents or whoever passed away before you. And there's this it reminds me of think of your favorite movie, the most interesting movie, where you had a great protagonist with a really great antagonist, and the tension left you on the edge of your seat. You're not sure what's going to happen next. Some enemies become friends. Friends definitely become enemies. People are lost. New characters are introduced. And even the main protagonists, if you follow a trilogy at some point, you have 3 movies that are really good. Eventually maybe the main protagonist finds his way out. You start a new trilogy or whatever. But imagine this movie is 3 hours long, but it's a great movie. You can't even tell that time was moving. So it felt so quick that it was moving because it was like, wow, this is so good. And then you had a sequel, and then you had the third version of that. You had the trilogy. And then the producers of that movie decided that they would want to make a movie that is 20 hours long. But this 20-hour movie is just recapping what happened in the trilogy and just talking about how great the journey was in that trilogy. There's no new plot. There's no new characters. It's just reminiscing on how good the first 3 movies were. And you do that for 20 hours. How long could you sit through that? I imagine that's sort of the microscopic version of eternity for me. Whereas we just sit and talk about how good God was in that time, and there's no more plot anymore. And so, in its most literal sense, you find yourself back with everyone else who found no meaning in life before, in the life prior to the afterlife, where you just do things, and the only way that this will feel good is if you're just present with every moment versus being concerned with this endless amount of moments that are not amounting to anything else other than the same thing over and over and over again. So that begs the question, that brings us to where I'm at now, which is, well, Joe, why do you want to exist now? If life is no grand narrative, that if we could pull back the curtains, there wouldn't be anything behind it but an old man posing as a wizard. Side note, I find it funny that in The Wizard of Oz, the person who had the most power over people in The Wizard of Oz was Oz. Everyone revered and feared this great Wizard of Oz. And the one who had the most power over everyone there was the one who actually couldn't do magic. You had literal witches who can do actual magic, could actually fly and make stuff appear and disappear. And they had literal power. And they were just seen as sort of smaller players in the grand narrative of Oz. And Oz was just a dude behind a curtain with a big microphone. I find that odd. But if we were to pull back the curtains and there was nothing behind it, and all that there is essentially what meets the eye, or at least meets the telescope or the microscope, why do you continue living? Why is it, Joe, that you're not suicidal now? Why is it that you can find joy and contentment and happiness? I think for two things, and maybe there are 1A and 1B, but one is narrative, is that you still need narrative, which is why I unabashedly borrow from narratives. I think we all are trying to make sense of this life, and this is how I evolved. And this is the game that I'm playing. And it doesn't make it feel any less real, even if I knew there's nothing behind the curtain. That it really all is quite unimpressive, the lives we live in the grand scheme, not even the grand narrative, just a grand idea of the universe, that even if you were the most famous person in the history of humans, that every human that ever lived knew who you were. You're the most powerful one ever. You're still the most powerful and most popular person on a rock among millions of other rocks in a galaxy that is one among 100 billion galaxies. So that even if you're the most famous person who traveled around, you found out how to travel in between solar systems and conquer and colonize other solar systems in the Milky Way, you were still the most powerful and most known person in a galaxy that was one among 100 billion. It's not that impressive still, which is kind of crazy to think about. And so no matter how you cut it, no matter how you slice it, life ultimately doesn't revolve around you. It doesn't revolve around humanity. That your life is quite unimpressive, but quite rare nonetheless. No one in the universe is going to experience the universe the way that you do. That somehow the universe, the parts, we are made of the same stuff of the earth, and that is made of the same stuff of stars. And somehow those things gain consciousness. And the universe is now conscious of itself, and we have become the autobiographers of the universe. Even if it's just small parts of the universe, if I write about my life, I'm writing about the universe. I make this video and I'm expressing, the universe is expressing a part of itself. And I don't say that in some sort of mystical, like the universe is speaking through me. I mean, literally, pieces of the universe have come together to tell some story about itself. And I think that's quite interesting. And I find rarity interesting. I find rarity worthwhile. How do I define worthwhile? It just is. At some point, you do have to end up at it just is. Everyone does this. To sort of quote C.S. Lewis, who says, that a window is for looking through something. It's for looking through to see something, should I say, on the other side of it. I have a window so that I can see the trees and I can see the cars that pass by. But if I had an infinite amount of windows and all I saw was through a window to see it through a window, see through a window, see through everything. Well, why? Trying to get to the ultimate meaning of it all. Eventually, you see nothing. To infinitely see through everything is to see nothing. And at some point, just being okay with what you see through that window, however dusty it may be. But at some point, you end up with, it just is that way. It just is. And I don't think this is unique to people who are non-religious. It's another way of saying what the religious people say, which is, God said it was that way. Well, why is it that way? You can ask all these things of why we have to do this, and why is the world like this, and why are humans like this, and why is history like this, and why did this happen, and why is this going on? Why is the war going over in this country, and these whatever? And you can have all these narratives, these grand narratives. Well, say it says in Daniel, and then this prophecy in Isaiah says, and in Revelation, and whatever. Eventually, no matter how many explanations and narratives you come up with, eventually you come back to, well, why? Eventually you come down to, that's just the way God made it. So, to me, the religious narrative is a more decorated and maybe even an interesting way, just another interesting way of saying the same thing of it just is. That all meaning eventually leads to some finite point where you don't see any meaning past it. That meaning eventually is infinitely lost in God. The one who gives you the meaning, eventually the meaning stops at him, at them. It stops at, because I said it is this way. And for me, it's, well, the universe is this way. That's just kind of how things were constructed. Well, how do you get this and why am I up? And so I think for me, it's one of the reasons why I don't too much concern myself, one, with the argument of the existence of God. I don't think the way that religion has presented itself and the way the world has presented itself and how we've argued and how we think about God, I don't think that you'll ever be able to fully disprove or prove God's existence. So in that sense, I'm agnostic. But I don't live my life in concern with it anymore, of trying to figure out what this grand thing is. At some point you keep getting to, whatever it is, this is the way things are. And I think if that's the case, if I'm going to go on living, and I am, and I don't mean that in an arrogant sense, like I'm going to live forever. I'll live as long as, I don't know how long I live, but I'm saying I'm choosing to live as someone who has wrestled deeply with the prospect of not living. I want to live. If the opportunity is there for me, I'm going to do it. And I just haven't tried to waste too much time these days trying to figure out the why behind it, because it's an ad nauseum thing. It's an infinite regression. You don't end up really anywhere. You end up just pontificating and thinking and forever versus just living. And I tip my hat in some sense to the religious who have sort of found that's just the way it is. That's the way God made it. And they go on living in that space. I kind of took the scenic route, but we, in some sense, end up at the same conclusion that, it just is. It is what it is, man. It's probably the most basic yet profound philosophical statement. It's that it is what it is. And I'm done trying to peek behind the curtains. And I don't consume myself too much now, my time with, cosmology and how the universe, it's interesting, it's novel, but I don't take it on as some sort of life journey that I've got to figure out. Because it all kind of leads to the same road. And that's okay for me. And I've also given up the desire to make this reasoning. I've tried to articulate myself well in this video, And I'll never be able to articulate myself well enough for someone who disagrees with me to ultimately agree with me if they don't want to. And you have to be okay with that in your journey. In the same sense that people's religious explanations to me are, they're good enough for them, but they're not good enough for me. And so I just reject it and say, it's not good enough for me. And that's okay. I had a woman come up to me after an event. This is my first time going to a church being on stage at a church, for that matter. I had preached my last sermon at the top of 2021, and I knew it was going to be my last. I felt it was like, I don't think I'm going to do this no more. I think I need to go sit my behind. I wasn't quite sure that I was done with Christianity, but I was definitely done with preaching. I was like, you don't need to be on nobody's stage talking about Jesus. You need to sit your behind down somewhere and figure some things out. And I felt that. And I did this book tour. Came on as like a guest panelist for a good friend of mine. And it wasn't necessarily a book tour. It was just a tour, a creative tour. It was really cool for what it was. And he had done it before, and I went to just watch it, and it was in some really neutral spaces. But then this time around, I didn't know that it would be in churches. I didn't know that till the day of, and I'd already committed to it. I was like, I did not know I was going to be in church. This is crazy. And so that was odd. But after that, a woman came up to me, and she said that she was on a similar journey of, questioning faith and, whether or not she wanted to be a Christian anymore. But after our conversation, I really suspected that she still really wants to be a Christian. She wants it to work, and maybe she's not okay with living with the implications of Christianity or religion in general being false. And so she's asking me about meaning, how do you find meaning and morality? And I'm essentially kind of telling her in many different words, but some of the same things I'm saying today, and me just sort of resting in the now and being present with what life is right now. And also being okay with coming up with stories and myths and so forth and having fun with life. And I even talked about how morality is always a subjective thing. Morality has always been a thing that is agreed upon among the group, whether that group is local, state, national, global, religious, ethnic. The group decides what is right and wrong to do. That has always been the case. It just makes it uncomfortable when we really see that to its furthest conclusion and realize that morality in a lot of ways is relative. And it'd be more useful to think that it was absolute, but that doesn't necessarily, again, make it truthful. It doesn't necessitate that is the way that it is, that there is a grand arbiter of truth and morality out there. And whether or not I made a good argument or not, she was like, well, that's not good enough for me. That's just not good enough. She kept saying it's not good enough for me. And my response, which I think was appropriate, I didn't mean it in a sarcastic, I meant it in a literal way. I meant it in the most genuine way. It's not supposed to be good enough for you. That's your journey. It's good enough for me. It's where I'm at. I'm at peace with it. I've wrestled with it for years, and this is where I'm at. And I don't have to prove it to everyone else in order for it to be settled in me. I wish I can create some sort of nuance of like, this is not just saying, well, my truth is my truth and I can believe whatever I want. I think you should wrestle deeply. I think you should really ask a lot of questions and not be okay with easy answers, not be okay with pat answers, and be up at night sometimes wrestling with the heavy thoughts of life. But like I said before, we all at some point end up at that is the way it is. It's just the way it is. Whether I'm comfortable with that truth or not, that is the way it is. And I think that for those who have left Christianity or left religion, oftentimes you can feel like you've got to keep coming back and playing the game. I remember, was it Barnabas? Maybe not been Barnabas. One of John Piper's sons, reformed, well-known preacher, wrote "Desiring God, Don't Waste Your Life." And his son, who's no longer a Christian, was raised in a very Christian home and environment. He said something to the effect on IG. I loved it. He was like, "You don't have to play the game. You can punt the ball." They want you to come back and say, "Well, why did you leave?" And some people are genuinely interested in it. But a lot of people want to know why, so that your answer can be deemed good enough or not good enough. And it rarely ever will be good enough. And I'm like, that doesn't make sense. And maybe your answer doesn't make sense. Some people do have really trash reasons for leaving Christianity. I've even pushed back on some people. I've had friends and people I know who are like, "Well, I left Christianity. I don't think Christianity is true because, all these different Bible translations, and they just keep translating from one copy from the King James, and that's another version, and we don't really know who said what." I was like, that's actually not how textual. It's not how, the transmission of the scriptures worked. The Bible is the most. This is a great apologetic point for Christians, is that it is the most documented source of antiquity or literature of antiquity. We have way more copies, and even if those copies may have errors and different interpretations along the way, and we don't have the original copies. There are no original copies of any part of the Bible anywhere. They're all copies of copies, sure, and even still, there's way more of them than any other book in antiquity. That doesn't make all the claims of it true, but it's documented, right? So there are some trash reasons I'm like, well, this is not good. It's not a good logical. But either way, at some point we all end up at, well, that's just the way it is. That's just, and it's quite subjective, unfortunately. You can try to be as objective as possible, but you cannot escape the presuppositions that you may have, the assumptions that you have about the way that life and information and knowledge work, etymology and, all that stuff. But at the end of the day, you don't have to play the game with them. That if you've wrestled and you've worked at it, you've thought through this, you don't have to allow other people to sort of trick you into playing the game with them again. It matters to them that the answer be a certain kind of way. It doesn't have to matter to you. It only matters as much to you as you want it to matter. And on this side of things, I'll end with this. There is some beauty. There's a lot of beauty. And one of the beautiful things that I've experienced outside of the framework of religious meaning and purpose and leading to some other moments, always being connected to some following moment, and the moments themselves never really owning their own weight. As I go to the gym every morning, I walk and I pass the same woman every day who is unsheltered, does not have a home, and she stays on the street. Pass her every day, as many other people do, and I've learned her name. She's learned my name. And many of those days, I give her change. I give her money. Sometimes I'll ask something else that she needs. Is there anything else that you need besides the money? Can I get something for you? And there's been items that I brought back to her. And I love the freedom that those moments are just those moments. There's nothing in the back of my mind that's thinking, okay, what's the next step? When do I tell her about her sin and how much she needs Jesus, and that the physical poverty that she's experiencing doesn't compare to the spiritual poverty that she truly has, and that ultimately there is a purpose to all this struggling? And how do I make that make sense to her, that the struggle that she goes through will mean something, and that God will reward her, that the meek shall inherit the earth, and that, it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven than a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. And so someone as humble as you, being poor, can receive this gospel in a much easier way, in a childlike faith. Like, I'm not thinking about any of that. I'm not burdened by those steps that I have to take for this relationship that I'm building with her. The relationship is just a relationship. Whether it ends today or it turns into something that I see for several years, I don't know. I'm just here today. And I know that today, if I was experiencing the same thing she was going through, I'd like for someone to do that for me. I'd like for someone to not pass me up, to learn my name, to get me things that I needed. I'd like that. That would make my life a little easier. I'm not saying it would solve all my issues, but it would solve the issue that I have right now in this very moment. I'd like that for me. And that just becomes the ethic. And it's no longer a manipulation to try to get to some point, to check off my box, my witnessing box, my evangelism box, that I did it and I feel good about this, that I witnessed to someone, I invited somebody to church, rather than just helping them because it would just make their life easier. And I think that that's, for me, has become a much more genuine type of empathy, rather than doing something because I believe that in some other moment that is not now, I will have a reward. That somehow I'm adding decoration to my rooms in heaven because I'm helping this woman. And at that point, it doesn't really seem all that altruistic. And maybe none of it is ever really altruistic. I'm still doing it because it feels good for me. True. It does feel good. It does give me something to do it. But it kind of stops there. It is what it is. There's not a, but why? It makes you feel good, but then what else? It's like, it feels good because no one else knows about it until now. I guess I'm sharing it with y'all, but it's not a thing. It's not a program. It's just, you do it because, I don't know. That's just the way it is. Do-do-do, do-do-do, do-do-do. That's just the way it is. So anyways, I think I did under 45 minutes. We're good. So questions, comments, leave it in the comment section. You know the drill. I'd love to engage with y'all. And I'm happy for this journey that I'm on. And I hope you are too. I hope you're getting there. Check out my videos about morning routine and how that can help you with creating some rhythm for joy and happiness in your life, as it has done mine. And I hope y'all are well. Happy Black History Month.